Let's get going. I'm with you, Michael. So I'm very excited. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Darius Kemp. I want to give a quick thank you to some amazing people from the UC Berkeley Cannabis Research Center, Joanna, who is helping to moderate and manage the webinar today, and Michael Polson, our executive director. Yeah, all the applause. Thank you. And everyone else from the CRC who have contributed and helped. So thank you all for getting it together. I am your host today, Darius Kemp. I am a member of the CRC, a graduate student at UC Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy. I am also a former cannabis kind of executive and director with Ease as the head of equity, and also with Cureleaf as the national director for social equity business development. And I'm so glad to be here today with Dr. Olena Sambucci as well. So just a really quick rundown of our agenda. We will be speaking, do a quick introduction of our speaker here, Dr. Olena Sambucci, and then we will have a really great conversation with her about her research and what's going on in the industry today. We will reserve some time on the back end for Q&A with anyone. So if you have with the attendees and our guest here, so if you have questions, kind of get those ready, kind of take down some notes. You can put those in chat, or we may be able to get you in visually there, or vocally if you want to make those comments. And then we'll tell you what's up next. So we have a bunch of additional great brown bag series events coming up in November, later this month, and also in December, with some amazing guests. And so we will be talking about that. Yes, please check out our website. I believe that will be in the link, sorry, in the chat. A link for that will be in the chat. And then yeah, there you go. Thank you. Some Zoom basics just for everyone. If you do want to talk when we are in the Q&A section, you see how the audio works, the chat feature there if you want to type your questions. And I love reactions. So if you hear something or see some or someone says something that you want to give applause to or hearts to, please do that. I think a little good feedback is always great in these kinds of events. Yeah. So why don't we just go ahead and start by introducing our amazing guest today. I want to introduce Dr. Olena Sambucci, who's a project scientist at the University of California at Berkeley, and a member
Thanks.
of the and a member of the Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics. Her research centers on agricultural production economics, with a significant focus on viticulture. Also, she's the deputy director of the Cannabis Economic Research Group at UC Davis, which is a part of the California Agricultural Issues Lab as well. So I want to again thank our amazing guest, Dr. Elena Sambucci.
Thank you, Darius. Yeah, so as you mentioned, the California Agricultural Issues Lab focuses on agricultural issues in California. By extension, we work on international issues and trade, obviously, because California is such a major player in global agricultural markets. And cannabis is a very interesting and major agricultural crop. So we do have a separate group that's devoted primarily, exclusively to research on cannabis. And over the last 2 years, we have completed several projects related to cannabis economics. My job is, so I'm involved in all aspects of research, from data collection to data analysis, publications, presentations. My primary job is working with large data sets. I'm not necessarily involved in kind of the latest news related to cannabis industry, but I work with data and I try to do it carefully, which means that sometimes it takes a while, right? So
That it does.
yeah,
Yes,
so
definitely.
that's I think that's I'm going to speak to mostly to my work today. So some of the some of that is has to do with current issues. Some of that has to do with things we have done and completed a couple of years ago.
I am very excited to hear about this because I will say, because my expertise is in social equity and cannabis and kind of that
Mhm.
business development side. But,
Yeah.
I work hand in hand a lot of times with growers and farmers. And so I'm super excited about learning more about what you're doing. So why don't we just talk about it? Kind of what is your, you have been funded by the California Department of Cannabis Control to do research on cannabis regarding the legal cannabis prices and economic impacts of regulation. Can you just provide us a quick summary of your work?
Yes, so we've had several projects that were funded by the DCC. I worked a little bit on a bunch of them. My work primarily, started as just looking at licenses issued to various cannabis businesses. So we looked at the distribution of various types of licenses over time, sizes and types. Today, I figured it's probably a good time to mention some of the work we've done on the cultivation side, because as you were sending me your questions, I thought a little bit about, okay, well, what do we see in terms of how the distribution of licenses changes, for example, over time for
Mm,
cultivators. Most recently, so since that was kind of the beginning of my work, and then since then I have shifted to looking at primarily retail data, so the track and trace data collected by the state of California. And my job is to look at, there are a lot of things we don't know about cannabis, and I'll talk about some of those today, right? So the things that we know about many other products, like how much do people consume, we actually don't know with certainty about cannabis yet, right? And that's part of my job, is to look at prices and quantities sold at retail and see what happens over time, and also do some economic modeling that would allow us to estimate just some basic market parameters that we can then use as an input into economic models that can look at the various impacts of demand and supply shifts on prices and quantities in that market.
mm. If you don't mind me asking, if I can dig a little deeper into what you just said,
Mhm,
you mentioned kind of what are some things I think you would can infer from
mhm,
finding out kind of consumers consumption over time, but kind of
mhm.
can you give me a little bit more about that? Kind of what are some really fascinating things maybe you're interested in learning or have found out about kind of consumers' consumption habits?
Yeah, so part of fascinating things to me might not be necessarily fascinating things to the general audience. Partly I really just want to get kind of the basic understanding of what is cannabis as a product compared to other agricultural products, right? So it's an interesting one, because we still have a very well represented illegal sector in cannabis, which we don't in other products, right? And that's part of the kind of the problem, interaction between the licensed and unlicensed cannabis in California. And that's unique to cannabis. We don't really have that for other agricultural commodities. There may be a great market for strawberries. I don't know, but not, um,
I hope not. I
yeah,
hope there
right.
are there isn't a great market for
So and
strawberries.
then and then partly just looking, so understanding, what's happening on the retail side of cannabis over time, what's happening to prices and quantities and different types of products that are sold on the market, or are coming to the market, or increasing in importance at the market. So that's, some of that is just kind of pretty tedious but fascinating to me. And then I think some of the questions that frequently come up as interesting to other people is, for example, THC content in cannabis products, specifically dried flower. So because there's always some discussion about, is that something that, we should specifically focus on? What do consumers care about? What are do consumers want more THC? Do we see more THC content and so on? So that's some of the, also some of the work that we've done that looks at that.
I I love that because that has been a constant debate around like low THC levels versus high versus what
Mhm.
does that do for around policy in terms of as regulators try to determine what those levels should be. So I find it very fascinating. So kind
Yeah.
of staying in that vein, kind of what current policy findings are you making, and how do you believe they address the core concerns of the industry, the regulators, and kind of government agencies right now?
Okay, so we don't directly work on policy, right? So we're not in the business of recommending policy. Our the findings that we have around the structure of the industry and the economic parameters, they're definitely relevant to people who then make policy. So I just want to be really specific about that, so we don't
Mhm.
make policy recommendations. So in terms of what we're seeing on the side of, and actually that's true for wholesale prices as well as retail prices. So I think it's pretty common knowledge at this point that prices, for example, peaked around in 2020 and have been declining since. And in the last year, mostly stabilized. But we did see a drop in prices across the board for wholesale and retail products. And it seems like that they're staying pretty constant right now, but they're definitely lower than they were in their kind of heyday of early to mid 2020. So that's one of the things that we noticed. And then in terms of THC, so it's an interesting question because part of my job, right? So I'm working on some research just estimating basic demand parameters for cannabis products. And one of the so essentially that's looking at the interaction of prices and quantities. So when you start
Mhm.
thinking about quantities of cannabis, right? So there's several major categories of retail cannabis products, and you have to think really carefully about what I mean. Typically, economists, for example, think in terms of a package or serving size, and it's pretty straightforward for things like cereal. Even though for cereal, it's not as straightforward as it may sound, but it's not at all
Mm.
for things like cannabis, right? Because we are looking at dried flower products, just packages of 1/8 flour, for example, is the dominant dried flour product, and vape cartridges, which is a totally different product, as well as edibles, and then pre-rolls are the minimally processed dried flour product, which is just flour rolled in a way that you can smoke. And then additionally, there are also infused flour products that have been kind of growing in popularity recently, and edibles, right? So thinking about how what is a, for example, a serving, what is a typical package? What kind of choices do consumers make, right? So when somebody walks into a retail store and they buy something, what are they choosing between? Are they choosing between different types of dried flour, or are they deciding between cannabis, like in a flour form and a pre-roll or a vape pen? So we really get into the nitty-gritty of this. And one way to think about it would be to think about, grams of THC, for example, right? Because THC content is differs by type of product. So that's something that we have given some thought to. And we don't, so in terms of THC content in retail products, vape cartridges and are obviously on the higher side, and that's something that you can, you can basically, the manufacturer can decide what they can put in the cartridge, right? And that's what it's labeled as. But flour, the THC content of dried flour comes from the cannabis plant, right? So, and then the THC content of that flour is whatever is in the plant. And one of the interesting things that we have found is that while prices have dropped, so for example, a price of a typical flour package, which is an eighth of flour, has decreased from around $32 on average, sometimes 32, 35 in 2020, down to about 22 currently,
Mm.
22, 23. At the same time, the listed THC content of that the dried flower has increased from around 25% to 29%. So, and that's, 25 to 20, so 29% THC is fairly high for dried flower. And so that's some of the, and that kind of tracks with some of the discussions that, we hear about kind of
Yeah.
specific interest in THC content in products.
Are you seeing any correlations there, especially as you look at kind of the decline in prices? Like, are you noticing anything? Because that's a significant drop in prices for a consumer, $10 or so.
Yes, so right, it is a significant drop in prices. The way that price is formed for example, for cannabis, so this is where licensed cannabis, price of licensed cannabis differs from the price of unlicensed cannabis, for example, right? So at each stage
Mm,
of production, so starting with cultivator, so there used to be a cultivation tax on flower. There's not anymore, but for a while until I think mid 2022. But at each stage, so as the flower kind of moves from cultivator to processor through distributors to retail, there are various markups added to that product. And the markups, in our language, are reflective of the value added at each stage of the
mm.
supply chain. And the value added is, sometimes it's as straightforward as, packaging. It's more convenient to buy cannabis in a package and et cetera, if it's a processed product. So, if I want a gummy, I don't have to make it myself, right?
Yeah, right.
But so that's one part of it. The second part of it is it has to reflect the costs of that stage of the supply chain, right? So whatever the businesses that are moving this product along, whatever costs they have get built into the price. And in terms of licensed cannabis, it's not just taxes and fees. So taxes and fees are clearly part of that cost, right? And cannabis is highly taxed in California, but it's also costs of regulatory compliance, like having a license for your business and following the rules that you have to follow in order to operate a business. So all of these regulatory costs are also part of the price of cannabis.
Yeah.
Right. So in that sense, the price of cannabis reflects all of these costs. And so the legal cannabis is more expensive than illegal cannabis because of that. At the same time, we do see a drop in prices. In some, I mean, partly it's also due to the fact that people are becoming more efficient at producing products, right? So cannabis is
Mm,
there's a lot of technology and a lot of learning that's happening. And so part of the drop in prices is just people are getting more efficient at producing, and so that just reflects the kind of that as well.
I think that's a really good point. Like my base level, economics there does tell me, right? Like
Mhm.
innovation that lowers these prices is good for everyone broadly. I'm really curious about that. If you don't mind, would you say California is kind of on a cutting edge of that kind of innovation right now? Because, all of the economic energy, if you will, I think is on the East Coast right now as new developing markets from New York to New Jersey to Ohio to Florida and Maryland are all coming online. But would
Mhm.
you say that California is kind of leading in that kind of innovation of production and growing and agricultural?
In some ways, so California is the largest producer and consumer of cannabis, and it's historically has been the largest producer of cannabis. So there's a lot of knowledge about cannabis production in California that already existed before cannabis even became legalized. A lot of that knowledge specific to California has been, in places that have traditionally grown outdoor cannabis, such as, the North Coast regions. But now, so one of the things we see, and we start seeing that when we start looking at licenses issued, for example, is there is a growth in indoor cannabis production, right? So indoor cannabis is produced very differently from outdoor cannabis. It's a lot more resource intensive. Main inputs are, labor and electricity. I think some water, and it's also capital intensive because you have to have a pretty sophisticated operation. So in that sense, California has obviously, I mean, California is technologically advanced. Whether it will continue to have a competitive advantage in it's not necessarily, we know prices of electricity are not necessarily the most competitive in California. So I think one of your later questions was about what would happen, if other, there, if cannabis was federally legal, which we can discuss a little bit more, but you have to think about what resources go into the production, and where we have the advantage now, would we continue having that advantage in the future, right? So if cannabis was produced elsewhere, for example.
Um, Oh, so I'm gonna kind of we're gonna kind of stay a little bit on this topic a little bit. There was a really good comment someone made that I just wanted to bring up really quickly, but I think it's really interesting that while the average price has gone down, you know, what's happening to the range of prices? What's happening at the higher and at the lower end of these prices?
So at the lower end, prices for licensed cannabis have definitely dropped by a lot. I mean, we do start seeing some really cheap cannabis that, in the past you could only get that on the unlicensed market. On the higher end, I as far as I remember, there hasn't really been. I mean, there's always kind of the higher priced premium segment in cannabis,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I can't tell. I mean, as I recall, those prices have stayed, like the higher end prices have stayed around the same. Like we don't see anything. There may be an outrageous outlier there somewhere. But cannabis it's if you think about, for example, wine, right? So there's
yeah,
definitely a premium, and there will always be a premium market segment for wine. In terms of quantity, it's very small. In terms of value, it's proportionally larger than the quantity because the prices are higher. But the majority, I mean, the majority of cannabis is not going to be in that market, and
yeah.
it's not what we see in the data now. So kind of the average prices are declining, and part of that is we are seeing some really low prices for eighths of flower as well, not just high.
I think that's yeah, I think that's really great because you're correct that the upper end more boutique
Yeah.
prices they're gonna stay there. You know, I've seen prices as high as like 78 or 88
Yeah, yeah,
dollars
yeah,
for an eighth
exactly.
of
Yeah,
boutique
yeah.
flower.
That's pretty much. I think that's what I've seen as well in the data on the higher end.
Yeah. Kind of moving on a little bit here, based on your research, can you speak to how California's cannabis taxes and regulations are impacting that unregulated market? Since we're, talking a lot about kind of what the regulated prices are, kind of, what does that look like on the unregulated side?
Well, so on the unregulated side, so you don't have the taxes, right, that you have to pay. So the price will reflect that. There are also no regulatory compliance costs, right? So if you just consider those two things by side, um, it's pretty clear that unlicensed cannabis is cheaper for those reasons.
Mhm.
Um, there are some. I mean, I can't speak to quality. I mean, anecdotally, there is a difference in quality, right? So, and also legal cannabis gets tested, right? So that's one of the advantages. So, for example, for consumers that are coming on the market and they have never bought cannabis from the unlicensed market before because of the stigma of buying something illegal, they now want to consume cannabis, and it's comforting to know that exactly what's in the package, right? Because of the testing. So that's one thing that we could consider as a quality advantage. Other than that, I can't really speak to that because there aren't really, I mean, for obvious reasons, there aren't real data on prices and quantities of the illegal cannabis, right? There are a number of papers published, and people are doing the work to kind of trying to estimate the size of the illegal. So what's consumed in California legally versus illegally, and so there are some kind of estimates which always have a range, right? Because the way that they're done, and we have looked at them and we have tried to improve on them a little bit. So the way they're done is these are answers to a survey, right? So if somebody, it's a survey where the government calls you and asks you how much cannabis do you consume. So as you imagine, there's there's a lot of underreporting, right, in terms of what people answer to that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and then and we know from studies, so with alcohol, for example, there are reliable data on quantity of alcohol that is sold. And so we can compare, if you compare that to what people report they consume, the underreporting is as high as 50%.
Wow.
Right. So there's a lot more sold than people say they consume. We wouldn't expect that to be any different from cannabis, and maybe
Yeah.
even more, maybe less now, because now cannabis is legal, so you're less likely to have to lie about it, right? Again, so all of these estimates are very rough, and we just don't, but we do still, I mean, I think most estimates are that there's still more illegal cannabis consumed in California than there's legal cannabis. But again, it's in terms of numbers, I don't know. And then in terms of prices, so I started talking a little bit of about price formation. So illegal cannabis will be cheaper. There are other costs associated with, well, it's risky to run an illegal operation, and you might have to pay fines, et cetera, et cetera. But it's still very competitive. And, from the consumer perspective, the consumer might not know what they're buying. So there are
Yeah.
storefronts that are operating illegally, and it looks just like a regular store. And if you're ordering delivery, it's even less visible as to whether you're getting legal or illegal cannabis, and especially in
Mhm.
jurisdictions that don't allow retail sales, right? So throughout
Yeah.
California, there are a lot of municipalities that prohibit retail stores. So in
Yeah.
that sense, I mean, there's really illegal cannabis prices have gotten closer to legal prices, just because, as I explained, there are many elements that go into
Yeah.
this decline in prices, but they're still going to be higher just because of the regulatory block costs, for sure.
Yeah. I want to, Elena, I want to also do some engagement with the audience
Mhm.
here because there's some really
Yeah,
smart
I was
people
looking,
in
it's
the room.
12:30, so it's question time according to the schedule. Yeah.
We're getting there. We
Yeah.
do. I want to bring up a note here from Mitchell Colbert, who is
Okay.
a cannabis waste researcher, and he's noticed
Mhm.
that he's seen greater packaging weights on unregulated prices as they attempt to mimic overpackaged regulated products. So, kind of undergirding your point there, kind of supporting your point there.
I'm sorry, you said greater package weights? Yes, okay.
Yeah, he's saying greater packaging weights. Yeah, sorry, greater
Yeah,
packaging
so yeah,
weights from the unregulated
they don't
market.
have to, right, they don't have to follow regulations as to package size, for example.
Yeah.
So that, yes, and also for example, in edible products, so like gummies, limited to 10 milligrams of THC,
Mhm.
does not have to be the case for unregulated product, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So let's get one more question. I have one more question for you, and then we'll move into the Q&A. So, one final question here. Do you have you have done extensive research on the wine industry. What are
Mhm.
some lessons from the wine industry that cannabis can learn as we hopefully move towards that kind of federal legalization, kind of bringing that piece back?
So one lesson is there's really no more illegal wine industry. I mean, there used to be, right, during Prohibition. So in that
Yeah.
sense, it's interesting to track that and see, wow, okay, right now nobody's illegally producing wine or cigarettes, really. So on near nowhere close to the scale that we see in cannabis. So that's one interesting lesson. The other is so in terms of federal legalization, there are different pathways to that, right? So one pathway would be for descheduling, which would just remove cannabis from the drug, and then it just could be like any other product.
Yeah.
Another pathway would be where cannabis is legal in every state and trade across states. So it's legal now to transport between states, but it's regulated similarly to what we see in, like California. So there's a federal agency that oversees, and there are taxes and fees, et cetera. So in that case, that's a different pathway. Right. So that's something to think about. What kind of regulation will we see when it is federally legal, if any? Another lesson would be that so in as so I know I touched a little bit on that when I was talking about, movement towards, for example, indoor cannabis. So if cannabis was federally legal and states could just, export cannabis or import cannabis from other states, you would expect to see cannabis production to move to where it's competitive. So that is, and in some ways, so I mean, inputs into cannabis production include land, labor, financial resources, electricity if it's indoor. And so you have to think about where, where that would be competitive. So right now, for example, if we compare California with Nevada, the lower end prices in Nevada are still much higher than lower end prices in California. So if California was now allowed to ship cannabis to Nevada, those producers would have a hard time competing. On this, at the same time, California has had this longstanding tradition of cultivating outdoor cannabis in a way similar to the way they grow nice wine, with some maybe appellations in the future and names of that people recognize, and that's the kind of advantage that is hard to replicate in other places, right? So I think it's if we saw this if the regulations were suddenly the same in every state, that's what you would see is cannabis shifting to where it's most competitive based on the way it's produced and the resources it requires.
Yeah, and this is just a little supposition on my part here, but I would think there's um I would think the other issue for a lot of these other states, maybe less so Nevada, but when you get into, the interior of the country, you move out east, like, there's also a culture and an expertise level, right?
Yeah.
That is
Mhm.
based here in California that
Yeah.
doesn't exist in Ohio, for example, or
Right.
Nebraska. So even
Yeah.
if they have the land and resources, that kind of cultural expertise and understanding may not be there.
Yes,
Would you agree with
exactly.
that?
So, I mean, that's definitely, I mean, but also, people can move, right? So if somebody was producing cannabis here and they realize that it's much easier to produce it and cheaper and they can make more money by producing it in Ohio, I mean, that's another, so human capital can also move around. But yes, you're right. So California definitely has an advantage in expertise.
Yeah, I guess that'll be a question when we get interstate commerce going.
Right.
That'll be a big
Yeah. So
question there.
yeah, there's still lots of questions about what does it mean to be, federally federally goes, but yeah.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
let's thank you so much. This is a really great conversation. I learned so much. I am so your research is fascinating. I am so glad to have done this with you. So let's move into some questions from the
Okay.
audience here. Our first one is up. Let's see. Um I would be interested in finding out what the quality of the product and the size of the business that have participated in this price drop. So I think someone's kind of asking here, do you see any kind of trends there in terms of bigger companies having lower prices or other kind of issues there in terms of business size versus in relation to the prices?
So that is something we're still looking at, right? So, in order to understand kind of, so we looked at average trends and prices, right? So as we joke, the funding has ended, but the research continues, which often happens in the academic environment, right? So looking at whether different businesses charge different prices, that's, something that we don't have good answers to that yet. Part of that is because, in order to know what the size of the business is, you have to think about how you define that, right? So are you defining it by revenue, in which case, well, if it's a business that charges lower prices but sells more quantity, I mean, so you have to really think carefully about what you define business size as, or if you define it by volume sold, like weight of different cannabis products, which is not very straightforward actually to calculate using the data that we have. So it's something that we are carefully still looking at, but that is definitely an interesting question. Yeah,
Yeah.
like to answer.
Yeah. I mean, oh yeah, there's still, I think you would argue there's a lot more research to be done. There are a lot
Oh,
of
there's
unanswered
a lot. I
questions.
mean, there's surprising. I mean, we still really don't know. I couldn't give you a reliable estimate of, for example, total production of cannabis, like cultivated cannabis,
Wow.
by weight. I mean, it's really less straightforward that you might imagine. Versus, we do have those numbers for other crops, even though there's always some margin of error. But yeah, this it's really a fascinating area of research. So yeah.
That's great. I mean, great for research purposes,
Yeah.
not maybe so great for the
Yeah.
industry as a whole. Another interesting question, I think, kind of related to these price drops, and I know this person and the products they make, so I'm going to interpret this question. So they want to know how the price drops have impacted product categories outside of dried flower, like edibles, tinctures, and concentrates and drinks. I think the question is also kind of couched in the idea of, with the reduction of dried flower products, is are we seeing that knock-on effect go to these other products?
There's some drop in the dried flower products, and there was also over the same time a slight drop in the price of vape cartridges as well. So those prices are not growing. They have also declined over the same period, and that for the last year they have been mostly stable on average. We don't really see a drop in, we did not see a drop in prices in edibles and pre-rolls as much. I mean, and those are typically, that's if you're thinking like of a typical package the consumer buys, those are on the cheaper side. So it's typically, I mean, it's cheaper to buy a pre-roll or two, in a package than it is to buy an eighth of flour.
Mm,
So maybe for that reason, I don't know. Yeah, but we mostly see
yeah.
the drop in prices on the flour and some in vape cartridges as well.
Yeah. So, but we're not really seeing it that much in some other areas. So that's really interesting. Thank you for that question, Chelsea.
But also
Um,
remember the flour products and edibles together are, well over 60% of retail sales, right? So that's the majority of the market. So the other categories are still much smaller. Yeah.
California is still flower smoking
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
industry, state.
Yeah.
So that's really fascinating. A really an interesting question here from Joanna. What effect does eliminating specific taxes, for example, cultivation or excise taxes, have on the market share of licensed cannabis, and how would this impact overall tax revenue?
Yeah, so that depends on what kind of tax you're eliminating. So in the beginning of our research, we did this analysis just using a simulation model. It's kind of like in some ways basic economics, right? So when you reduce taxes, the prices fall and the quantities increase, et cetera. And so the effects on the tax revenue could be, there could be no effect, there could be very slight negative effect, there could be a positive effect depending on the change in quantity. But one thing we don't really know in order to answer that question with any degree of certainty is the shape of the demand and supply curves, right? So that's actually what we're working on, right? So in economics, we have to estimate parameters like elasticity of demand and elasticity of supply. And that has been done for other products, right? So there are always improvements in methodology, but for cannabis, it's still a very early. It's just still the research is still very early, and there. I mean there's a range of parameters one could use to say, well, that's about what other people have found, but all of these are very preliminary results, and these just, I mean, I wouldn't consider there to be like, a kind of cornerstone estimate of these parameters. So until we do that, the best we can do is do the simulations using a range, just saying, well, what if these parameters vary um, within these reasonable ranges, right? And what we have found, so one of the things to consider, so for example, eliminating cultivation tax, which DCC has done, would have a very small, it had a very small effect on tax revenue because cultivation tax was imposed at the cultivation stage, so it was per pound.
Mm,
And that on on flower products, or dried flower equivalent. And it had a significant, it probably contributed a little bit to the drop in prices, because the way cannabis products are taxed are, each markup is added on top of the, for example, the cultivation tax effectively became a part of the wholesale price. And then it was marked up in the process of manufacturing, right? And as products get marked up and taxed, taxes that are imposed early in the supply chain then contribute more to the resulting price. So if you remove taxes that are imposed early in the supply chain, it reduces the price more for the same amount of tax, right? In fact, loss in tax revenue, if that makes sense. So that's something that we have some, we published some early results, or I think it's part of one of our reports to the DCC, but we're still working on kind of like basically just trying to contribute to that literature that people can refer to when they do these models later on. So that's part of the work we're still doing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There's another really interesting question here. You know, I don't think I fully understand it, so I'm gonna try to edit it into a way I think that they're saying it. But I don't know what kind of experience do you have in the kind of understanding the medical market for cannabis, Olena?
Well, I
Like,
don't have experience. Yeah, so we
yeah,
do. So in the data that we work with, there is differentiation between medical and adult use cannabis, but in California, since mostly it's adult use now, so the
yeah.
medical it's very small share of the data that we work with, and so I unfortunately beyond that I don't really have experience.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll kind of bypass. I don't want to kind of have that question if we don't have enough kind of
Okay.
information there to answer it appropriately. But there's one more question here in the chat.
Mhm.
As someone who works extensively with the state's track and trace data, do you have observations on the reliability and robustness of that data?
Well, that's a really good question. So it is, um, well, so you always want to think about how the data are collected, right? So track and trace data, and as anybody who is involved with the cannabis industry knows, they probably, if you have a cannabis business, you probably have a person responsible for entering these data into metric, right? So it is entered by many different people, and there, on that sense, there are always some errors in data that are, entered by a person. However, and depending on what kind of data, like we find that looking at cultivation data was actually more tricky than looking at, for example, retail data, right? So retail data is just whatever's on the retail receipt, and that's actually pretty reliable, pretty straightforward. Like we don't actually see that many errors in there. Cultivation data, when we try to, I mean, our first exercise was to add, it's like, well, how much cannabis is produced in pounds, and we were getting some very outlandish numbers. And then we realized that, one of the product categories that is not explicitly defined in the way, like you can choose a product category from when you enter the data, for example, is wet cannabis, which is cannabis that is sold before it's dried. And
Mhm.
that obviously weighs a lot more than dried cannabis. And so it's just, so we found like that's just one of the examples where if you just take the data and you say, oh, here's a cultivation report, and in the flower category, these are the pounds listed as harvested, without looking in more detail at the description of what was harvested, because it just categorized as flower, you will not get results that are correct, right? So in that
Mhm.
sense, it's not that the data are wrong, it's just that you have to really think hard about how what the variables mean, and kind of think about if you're seeing outliers, how to interpret those, and how to categorize things, and yeah, so it's I would say, it's like any data set, it's as reliable as careful you are, working
Yeah.
with it.
Well, and if I can follow up on that question really
Yeah.
quickly, kind of, what is the standardization? I would assume that, kind of you're using, of course, standard research methodology and
Mhm,
practices that are
mhm.
that are tried and true, but kind of in the cannabis industry specifically, kind of what kind of new kind of practices or categories, or kind of what kind of kind of solid kind of expectations and kind of requirements are being developed by you and other researchers, like, from the CRC and others. I'm just kind of curious, like, are we developing kind of new, interesting things within the cannabis research space that, kind of don't exist in other places to help us kind of answer a lot of these questions?
No, well, I think one of them is understanding this interaction between regulated and unregulated market. I mean, that's a very unique problem to cannabis. And understanding how, you know, kind of what does regulation look like, because obviously the point of regulating cannabis is you want all cannabis to be regulated, and you also want this industry to succeed, right, in that space. But it's kind of unavoidable that you're adding extra costs to people who are participating, but you're hopefully also providing some extra benefits, right, by making this product safer or more interesting to consumers, or I don't know, right? So understanding this interaction between licensed and unlicensed segments is extremely interesting. And also just, I mean, it's not often that you get a chance to kind of study a product that is fairly new to the market,
Yeah.
where like it's still how is cannabis, who consumes cannabis, how much cannabis is consumed, what are the trends and how does it change over time. That is extremely interesting.
Yeah. So I think I appreciate that. That's really really thoughtful and helpful. Um there's a question here is I'm gonna try to craft a question out of it. It's a bit more of a statement, but
Mhm.
I'm kind of curious. A couple of things. I think they want to highlight one that that you mentioned the efficiency and scale improvements, and so
Mhm.
I think there's kind of a question here around people are kind of agreeing with you that like the efficiency and scale improvements have helped with the lowering of prices from the lower end side of cannabis. Kind of, do you have any additional kind of thoughts about that kind of efficiency and scale improvements and how they've impacted kind of the lower end of cannabis prices?
Well, yeah, I think it's a comment. Is that a comment from Robin that you're
Yeah, a
reading?
comment from
Yeah.
Robin. Yeah.
Yes, and that's also yes, right. So the cannabis industry, because it was illegal forever, right? So unlike, for example, the alcohol industry, which was legal and then illegal and then legal again, and so there was already infrastructure to produce, kind of industrial production of alcohol beverages that would just have to kind of like, be repurposed for a while, but then it could just be used for production. And so there was an infrastructure for production and distribution set up on a large scale. That infrastructure has never existed for cannabis products because they were always underground, right? So now, as cannabis is becoming, so it's legal here, it's legal in many other states, maybe it will be federally legal. That infrastructure has yet to develop, and
Mhm.
it's going to, I mean, it's like anything, things that are produced on a kind of a mass scale, like lower end, cheaper things, are, it's sometimes easier to improve that production versus in terms of cost efficiency, other than, custom handmade things, because those take the high end cannabis products, they take, and this is not something I personally have a lot of knowledge about, but I know that there's a lot of skill that goes into trimming and selection and the special strains that people plant, so that you can't really industrialize very easily, so it's harder to draw prices on those products versus the cheap cannabis that is like, I don't know what would be the equivalent, bulk wine. Just put it in a box and it's all the same, but
Yeah.
it's, you can, if you reduce the cost of your box by 5 cents, here you go, you drop the price. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's really, I've seen those industrial trimmers. Like I was in a
Yeah,
factory and there and the guy was telling me about how expensive it is and how like there's only
yeah.
like one, there aren't that many companies that make things like this. And so to your point, legalization, I think, will open up that kind of broader engine of
Mhm.
innovation within the cannabis space to kind of lower those prices in the production side at least.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. One last question here we have from Matt. He's interested in your thoughts on if the light growing method, so outdoor indoor mixed light, for example, was required to be listed on reach, should be required to be listed on retail packaging. How consumer cannabis flower buying habits would be altered, and any potential shifts in cannabis flower wholesale and retail prices. So, kind of, what are
That's a
your
very
thoughts there?
interesting question, right? So I think for so I think so I think people still put that on labels voluntarily, maybe. That is actually I
They
haven't
do, yeah,
yeah, right. So and people will put that on labels if they think that gives them an advantage, right? So I know some consumers that are really into cannabis would care whether it's outdoor grown or indoor grown cannabis. I don't know that requiring that would, I mean, I really don't have an opinion on that at the moment. I'd have to think about it some more, about why would that, I mean, I don't know that there's a need for requiring it. I really don't know, but I think that people already put that on labels voluntarily because they think there are preferences, consumer preferences. And I don't know I don't know if there are, there, yes, yeah, I don't know.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. No,
yeah,
continue. Sorry, I
I
cut you off
think that, oh, look at that. There's a comment from Robin,
there.
who knows more than I do about labels, which is sun grown, for example, is the thing on some labels, even though outdoor cannabis is generally cheaper, but it's
Yeah.
never labeled as greenhouse indoor because it doesn't add value. So that's,
Yep.
that's, yeah, I do also, so I think we do know that there are some differences in terms of THC contents between outdoor and indoor cannabis.
Yeah.
THC content is already on the label. So indoor cannabis tends to have higher THC content, so in dried flower products, but it's already on the label, so there's no need to label it as indoor, right? So that would be the
Yeah.
only, yeah. And I guess indoor just doesn't sound good to people. I want to,
Right.
you want it to be grown in the forest in Mendocino. I want to be
Yeah.
grown in the warehouse.
it it is a value, right? Like if you
Right.
told people, "Oh, we grew these grapes indoors," they would be like, "Ooh, I don't."
Yeah,
There is a kind of a mental block, a kind of thing there where people think outdoor in the sun in the wild is just better, which it is, I think, broadly speaking.
right.
But rather than indoors, I'm also a member of the National Equity Trade Certification
Mhm.
board. It's a group that basically has created a national certification for social equity products in
Okay.
cannabis and social equity companies. Long story short, how this is connecting here is to your point. When I worked at Ease and we actually provided consumers with the information that these products were social equity owned,
Mhm.
there was an innate value that these
Yeah,
consumers put on that. So they were willing to pay higher prices for something that they deemed to have a better quality and went to a more active or more kind of valued group in their mind. So in that
exactly.
same relation to sun versus indoor.
Yeah. Yeah, and labels like social equity, so that may not have to do with outdoor or indoor, but that is something that people may value for those reasons, right? So I just like to, I like to know that my money is going to that program, for example. So I prefer, yeah. So and there's a lot of literature in economics on consumer preferences for different things that are put on the label, and cannabis is no different. So it is, I guess, something that is a thing for future research too.
I love this. So we are kind of sort of at time here. I'm trying to my all of the things are starting to kind of go.
Yeah, yeah.
Um I want to thank you again, Dr. Olena Sambucci, for being with us today and engaging with us. Your research is fascinating. If anyone wants to talk to her more, there are a couple of links here in the chat where you can find more information about the Berkeley Cannabis Research Institute. There's also a link at the very, very top with the UC Davis Cannabis Economic Group as well for more information. And I want to kind of let you have a moment here to tell us kind of any of your last thoughts, Doctor, if you have any, Olena,
Oh,
if you have any kind of
yeah, if
thoughts there.
anybody has any follow-up questions, please feel free to contact us. We'll be happy to answer anything. And as you can see on your screen, Robin is doing this in about a month. So if you, we can definitely include more information that, if anybody has any specific questions. But thanks so much for inviting me. This has been great, and I'm glad to be a part of this.
Thank you so much. This has been fun. And so I do want to mention our upcoming events on the 15th. So in about 2 weeks, we will be here again at noon. So go ahead and register for that. We'll be speaking with Dr. Ziva Cooper from UCLA's Center of Cannabis and Cannabinoids. That conversation will be kind of around her research around high potency and emerging cannabis products and rescheduling. And then in December, right while you're picking out your Christmas presents and your, Hanukkah presents, we will have Dr. Robin Goldstein from UC Davis, one of your colleagues, speaking with us on can legal weed win? So we're very excited about it. So please go ahead, register for all of these amazing brown bag lunch programs. Use your phone, click the links. Some links are in chat. And once again, I want to thank our amazing guest, Dr. Olena Sambucci, for joining us. And thank you for all of your hard work and, leading the industry and doing the much needed research that we all need.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I just want to say thank you from the UC Berkeley Cannabis Research Center. I want to thank again the amazing staff, Joanna and Michael and Peng, who helped put all this together, and everyone else within the CRC. Also, my colleague Isak and Nadia for joining us as well, and Chelsea. Thank you all. So, yeah, have a great rest of your day and go out and enjoy the sun.